WideAwakeNews Radio. I'm your host, Charlie McGrath. It's still the 26th day of June, Tuesday. And now joining us is the author, founder, creator, what do they say in RT? Base founder. It's the base founder of the Economic Collapse blog, Micheal Snyder. So if you're listening and not in the chat room, get in the chat. I'll pull questions out of there for Micheal during this hour. This is a great opportunity because we get him about once a month, and he's got a lot of great insight to what's going on. The number one article that I wanted to talk to him about is, where does your money come from? The giant Federal Reserve scam that most Americans do not understand. Now, I want to get into that, but before I do, let's really take a look at where we're at, how we got here, and what's being done in the name of banking interest. Those of you listening in the first hour heard me and Al and Karen and Ken talking about wars everywhere, and the continued bloodshed of our boys and girls and boys and girls around this planet. And somebody during that dialogue had said, it's the insurance companies, it's the banks. Look, it's all the banks. It's all the banks. And when I'm talking to banks, I'm not talking your local regional credit union or your local regional bank. I'm talking about the big boys. We call them too big to fail because they are the economy. And these same too big to fail own the Federal Reserve System. They are the cabal that controls this planet. Think about this for a minute. The world is in turmoil right now. Why? The world is in turmoil right now. It doesn't matter if you're talking financially. It doesn't matter if you're talking politically or militarily. The world is, without a doubt, a very much destabilized planet. All of this, all of it, soup to nuts, top to bottom, left to right, can be upwardly filtered to one primary source of the problem. And that is onerous fiat currency and onerous fiat debt. Everything is given a reason that we prosecute wars, or we prosecute more and more debt on the people. Everything is given this reason to stimulate growth, to stimulate the economy, to spread freedom and democracy, Western-style capitalism to these places around the world. This is all done through the control and issuance of fiat money. Without fiat money and the controllers of fiat money, fill in the blank would not exist anymore. You wouldn't have these out-of-control quadrillion dollars worth of derivatives. You wouldn't have this out-of-control national debt that is skyrocketing every single day. You wouldn't have countries issuing money that is linked and based in debt. Everything can be drawn to the money masters, the people who created the money, the people who created the debt, the people who are issuing the debt. The biggest con they've ever pulled off is convincing the people of the world that it is real, that it is factual, that it must be paid back, and that you must be indentured in order to pay this back. This is the biggest canard, the biggest scam ever pulled on humanity. There is more debt on this planet right now, and there's more people dying over this debt on this planet right now than is possible to pay back. We can't pay it back. It's mathematically impossible. So there is no Eurobond coming that's going to save Europe. There is a central bank that is coming to Europe that is going to be even more powerful than the central bank they already have. And we have a Federal Reserve in this country that is continuing to become more powerful, even though their charter's up in 1 year. This system is on the back of fiat fantasy money, fantasy currency, and fantasy fictitious debt. So, what better topic to talk about with Micheal Snyder than where does this money come from, and truly, who is behind the creation of this fiat fantasy? Micheal Snyder, the Economic Collapse blog. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you, Charlie, and it's great to be here. And yeah, these issues are foundational for people to understand. And every few months, I start getting some emails or I start getting some comments on the website that make me think, okay, I've got to write another article about the Federal Reserve again, because this goes to the very root, as you said, of our problems. And before I get into the Federal Reserve and all that, let's just kind of review where we're at as a nation and over in Europe as well. As a nation, you go back 30 years ago, and household debt, total household debt was just starting to approach the $2 trillion mark. Today, we're sitting at about $13 trillion. Or you look at the debt of the federal government. 30 years ago, we were just crossing the $1 trillion mark. Now we're getting ready to cross the $16 trillion mark. Or if you add up all debt, corporate debt, business debt, state and local government debt, federal government debt, household debt, you add it up into one big ball. 30 years ago, we were about $5 trillion. Now we're about to cross the $55 trillion mark. So in U.S. society as a whole, we've expanded this amount of debt that we have by 11 times in just the last 30 years. So how did we get here? It's not a mistake. It's because of central banking. It's because of our debt-based financial system. And it's the exact same thing that's bringing down Europe, because they all have central banks too. They're all under the same system, so they're all drowning in debt. And we look over in Europe, and the bank downgrades are coming so fast and furious now at this point, I can't keep track of them all.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of last week, we heard 15 major global banks downgraded. On Monday, 28 Spanish banks downgraded. It used to be about once a week. Now we're getting bank downgrades almost once per day.
Right. And the 15 last week were not just your run-of-the-mill, broken down democracy banks. These weren't little regional banks in Spain. The 15 that were downgraded last week are the ones that, that me, you, Micheal Snyder, we all bailed out in 2008. These too big to fails are now, failing once again. And don't think for one second it isn't by design, but go ahead, Michael.
Oh, absolutely. And this collapse is kind of built into the system. When you have a debt-based currency and a debt-based financial system, it's inevitably going to fail. And we're starting to see these failures all over Europe. Italy says, oh, now we need a bailout. Spain says, oh, we need $100 billion for our banks. Cyprus, they say, hey, what about us? We need a bailout, EU. Greece says, oh, we're going to need a third round of bailouts. So it's absolutely crazy. But how did they get here? How did we get here? Well, it goes back to central banking. It goes back to governments borrowing money. Now, why does a supposedly sovereign government have to borrow money from anyone? Why does the U.S. government have to borrow money from anyone? It doesn't make sense. The U.S. government, if it wanted to, could print its own money and spend it into circulation if it wanted to. But instead, what does the U.S. government do? The U.S. government, when it wants more money, when it wants another $1 billion to spend, it goes over to the Federal Reserve and it says, hey, Federal Reserve, we'll give you these U.S. Treasury bonds, which we've just created, which is debt, and in exchange, the Federal Reserve gives the U.S. government money that it creates out of thin air. The Federal Reserve just zaps it into existence and says, okay, here you go, U.S. government. And then the U.S. Treasury bonds are auctioned off through the Federal Reserve System. But what we have is we have a system where new money comes into the system through the creation of debt. And when that happens, more debt is created because the U.S. government has to pay back more money because of the interest on that debt. So more debt is actually created than the money. And in theory, what they tell us is, well, if we can get that money to circulate around really, really fast and we tax it at a pretty high rate, well, then eventually we're going to be able to pay back the debt and the interest and run the government at the same time. But in actuality, that never happens. And we've seen that doesn't happen. In actuality, what happens is there's not enough money to both run the government and pay back the debt and the interest. So what happens? Eventually, the U.S. government has to go back and ask for more money. So that's why I call the Federal Reserve System a perpetual debt machine. It creates a perpetual debt spiral that permanently entraps and enslaves the U.S. government, and there's no way out under the current system. And when you look, okay, how is the Federal Reserve done at creating all this debt? Well, if you go back to when the Federal Reserve was created just under 100 years ago, since that time, the size of our national debt has gotten more than 5,000 times larger.
5,000 times. That's since when? Since 1913?
Yes, since the Federal Reserve was created.
5,000 times larger. And Micheal Snyder, what has happened to the value of the U.S. dollar since 1913?
Well, the U.S. dollar has declined by well over 95% because what happens under this system, the amount of money and the amount of debt is designed to continually expand. And when you're continually adding additional dollars to the system, the value of all existing dollars is continually declining. And that's a hidden tax on all of us. So every single dollar any of us have in the banks right now they're continually losing value because more dollars are being added. So that penalizes those who try to save money, those who try to squirrel money away in the bank. It's a really insidious system.
It's absolutely it's insidious from the word go. And then we have people like Tim Geithner, head of the New York Federal Reserve, end up as our Treasury Secretary. Micheal Snyder, these are the most powerful men on the planet. Forget about the president, forget about your congressman or senator. They don't hold a candle to the kind of power that the folks who run the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, these guys are the ones who determine the fate of nations.
Oh, absolutely. And Ron Paul has even come out on national TV and he said, hey, the Federal Reserve is basically the fourth branch of government and they have more power than the U.S. Congress does. And so they determine our interest rates. They determine what banks get bailed out, what banks don't get bailed out. They determine the money supply. The truth is the Federal Reserve has more control over the economy than anyone else does. But what does the mainstream media do? They want us to get into fights about Romney versus Obama,
right,
and which one's going to be better for the economy. But the ones really to blame for the economy are the ones running the Federal Reserve.
Right. So, so in your opinion, and this is a rhetorical question, but in your opinion, now, we saw Rand Paul come out and give the glowing endorsement of Mitt Romney because he liked some of his ideas about auditing the Federal Reserve and getting the Federal Reserve under control. Have you ever heard such a ludicrous statement in your life?
Yeah, I was very disappointed when Rand Paul endorsed Mitt Romney because Mitt Romney, during the Republican debates, he got up there on stage and he started lecturing all of us about why we need a Federal Reserve.
Right.
And in fact, he said, I'm not going to, he's made statements that Mitt Romney has on the campaign trail that he's not going to spend his time going after the Federal Reserve. He's not concerned about it, that we need a Federal Reserve, and that now he's going to, get rid of Bernanke and put in someone else who will probably be just as bad. But the truth is Mitt Romney is a friend of the Federal Reserve because Mitt Romney is one of the greatest friends that Wall Street has ever had.
Absolutely, and I know the statement. Matter of fact, I'm trying to look it up on YouTube right now. I remember verbatim the when he was interviewed about the Federal Reserve and quickly shirking the question, quickly pointing out that we have to maintain an independent the independent nature of the Federal Reserve. We can't have the government involved with this policy making, and then they'll always use the argument that, look how ineffective government is. Can you imagine if they were controlling our money? Well, I'm holding the Constitution in my hand right now. This little tiny book that wraps up the founding documents of this nation. In Article 1, Section 8, it makes it absolutely crystal clear. Congress shall have power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. And we don't have that. We don't have that whatsoever. Congress now borrows money from a group of private banksters. The group of private banksters who tried for 100 years to establish the central bank system. They had it here once. Andrew Jackson cut the head off that beast. And in 1913, under President Wilson, they were able to get just that. And for 100 years, we've seen war after war around this planet. We've seen the accumulation of power and wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And we've seen suffering across this globe. And again, I go back to what I said at the opening. All of this, every single misery on this planet can be looked to. You can look to the financial system of this world and point the finger directly at the creators of the problem, which is this central banking cabal.
Oh, absolutely. And if you look back at Thomas Jefferson once said that if he could add a single amendment to the U.S. Constitution, if he could have added one more, it would have been a ban on all government borrowing. In fact, here's the exact quote from Thomas Jefferson. I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government to the genuine principles of its Constitution. I mean an additional article taking from the federal government the power of borrowing. So what Thomas Jefferson wanted to do, he said, man, I wish we could have got one more amendment in there which could have eliminated government borrowing. Now what have we done? we have a system where our very money comes into existence through government borrowing. So we've turned our backs on Andrew Jackson, on many of our other founding fathers who warned us about central banking. We've got a financial system entirely based on debt. And then we've got this fractional reserve banking, where that's another way that money is created by debt. If I go and I deposit $100 into the bank, well, they only keep a small portion of that in the bank, and then they go and maybe lend you $90, and all of a sudden there's $190 out there because I've got $100 and you've got $90. But the way that additional $90 came into existence was through the issuance of debt. So all of our money comes into existence through this debt-based system, and what it has done is it's created the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world, and it's inevitably going to fail. And the elite know this. The elite are getting positioned for it, and the people that are going to really suffer are all of us.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. And all that you have to do is look around the world to see that is an absolute fact. Do you really think the problems of the world right now are because your neighbor next door bought more house than they could afford? Do you really think the problems in this country right now are because we have too many immigrants coming across the border? Do you really think the world is on the brink of economic implosion because we have some nations in Europe that are lazy and some that are hardworking? Absolutely not. Turmoil is the weapon that these elites use. Destabilization is the weapon that these elites use to consolidate more and more power. You brought up a quote from Thomas Jefferson. In fact, a lot of people despise Woodrow Wilson for the creation of the Federal Reserve, but he was quoted later on in life as saying it was the biggest mistake he ever did, was turning over the reins of power to this Federal Reserve System. It didn't stop him from doing it, and he did do it. I mean, history should look at him for what he is, which is the sellout of the United States of America. But let me give you this quote. This is a quote from Baron Rothschild, right? The mega banker. Give me control of our nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws. These guys, these power elite, these uber elite, these people who are truly behind the too big to fail, they understand where power lies. It doesn't lie in a democracy. A democracy is a very handy tool that can be used in order to make the populace think they have a say in their own future. You do not. You do not have a say in your own future if you do not have a say over your own financial destiny. If you have to borrow money, if the money is created at debt, you are a debt slave. There is no other way to look at this. You're never going to pay off the debt of a nation. You're never going to be free of this onerous Federal Reserve System unless you completely and utterly abolish it and return to a constitutional republic where the government issues debt. The Congress, the people in a republic are powerful and strong because the power is decentralized and it isn't given in the hands of a very select few. What we have now isn't even a resemblance of a republic. We have a dog and pony show in Washington, D.C. arguing about gay marriage and border control and other completely meaningless issues to your future, and we leave the important decisions to a handful of select individuals who do not have to be elected and cannot be held accountable, and they are truly, truly destroying this nation from within and the rest of the planet. Look around. It's self-evident.
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry, Michael, I should have put a question at the end of that for you.
Oh, I was enjoying the rant, but it's true, and that's why it seems like every couple of months I write another article about the Federal Reserve and kind of try to explain the basics, because most Americans don't understand. If you go up to the average person on the street and you ask them some basic questions such as, where does money come from? They can't tell you the answer. So, one of the functions of my websites, hopefully, is that we're helping to educate people. So that if the American people, before they're going to agree to change to the restoration of the Constitution, they need to be educated about what we have now and about why it's wrong. So we're trying to wake people up, and your radio show is doing a great job trying to wake people up. And we need to keep going because, so much depends on it.
Without a doubt, you're 100% right. Now, we covered the Federal Reserve System and this fantasy money. I want to talk about fantasy debt. when we come back from our break. We're about to jump into our last break of the program. When we do come back, though, I want to talk about what's going on in Europe. And again, this is fiat money leading to fiat debt, leading to real blood in the streets. We're going to talk about that with Micheal Snyder on Wide Awake News Radio. We'll be back in 5.5 minutes. Hang tight. All right, guys, welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. I'm Charlie McGrath, your host, Micheal Snyder of the Economic Collapse blog, as well as the AmericanDream.com. It's the first time he's ever been on that I've not screwed up his second website. He's our guest for the hour. We talked about the Federal Reserve fiat money for the first half of the program that he was on. And I want to talk right now about what's going on with fiat debt, hold on one sec here. Let me, again, an issue with the quality here. I want to talk now about what's going on in Europe, fiat sovereign debt. You know, it's real. It's real to the point that the mainstream media, mainstream business media, is trying to terrorize the people of the world because of a sovereign debt crisis that is imminent. We have to give more power to Brussels. We have to give more power to the European Stability Mechanism, or the EFSF, or we have to give more power to the European Central Bank. We got to get rid of these parliaments. We got to get rid of these leaders and put technocrats in. All this fear is being generated. All these crises are coming down the road at record speed. Almost every day we have a new one, and it's all generated to have one effect, and that is to pave the way for these central bankers to come in and take over and control everything. Now, we've seen and dealt with the European debt crisis ad nauseum on this program, right? We talk about it almost every single day. At some point, we bring up what's going on inside of Europe. You know, Michael brought up a good point that every once in a while he has to go back and write an article on the Federal Reserve and fiat money and how we got here. Well, let's do the same thing in Europe. You know, the people of Europe, just like in the United States, they've seen their debt, their air quote sovereign debt, increase almost twofold, threefold in some cases in the last couple of years, because the answer is a central bank provided solution, which is we're going to pile up more debt on you in order to pay off debt so you can keep borrowing money to fund a lifestyle that is not feasible. But it's okay. As long as we keep piling on more debt and more debt, everything's going to be okay. But it isn't okay. And it isn't okay by design. It isn't okay because at the end of this all, when this does come apart, the answers are simple. Schäuble, he's come out and talked about the answer. So has Lagarde. So has everybody who's ever held a position of power in the financial circles of Europe. They want to get rid of constitutions in Europe and give more power to the European Central Bank so it can be more like, and even the Wall Street Journal is coming out recently saying, we need a Federal Reserve in Europe. It's about consolidating and controlling power. So debt is being issued by the central banks. Now the central banks are saying you got to give up your sovereignty in order to get the debt under control. Seems like a real simple shell game to me, but at the end of the day, it isn't the people who will be bailed out. It isn't. It's the central banks who are going to end up with control over everything inside of Europe. My question for you, Michael, how far along are we on this gambit? I mean, you know, we see Greece going for umpteenth round of bailouts. We see the borrowing costs of Spain and Italy and Portugal and Ireland skyrocketing out of control. It seems to me that this is about to reach a pinnacle where we see a major catastrophe inside of Europe, and then maybe touch on how this catastrophe in Europe is going to be immediately felt, not a week, not 2 weeks down the road, but immediately felt inside the United States and our financial system.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember the pattern that we've seen over the last couple of years. You know, there'll be a little crisis in Europe, and then the politicians in Europe will get together and they'll say, we've got a plan to save Europe. And then people like me will write, well, actually nothing's been solved. They kick the can down the road a little bit, but things are still on track for doom. And then a couple weeks or a couple months will pass, and then they'll say, things in Europe are worse than ever, but wait, we've got a plan to save Europe. And of course, then people like me will say, no, they're still not saving Europe, and then it'll come out later, worse than ever. So things just keep getting worse and worse, and none of these plans to save Europe have worked. But what did I see in the headlines again today? Another grand vision for Europe. You know, it's getting to the point of absurdity at this point. You look, unemployment in the Eurozone is at a brand new all-time high. You've got unemployment in Spain and in Greece well over 20%. Both of those countries are basically in the depression at this point. Youth unemployment in both countries is over 50%. You've got France, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, all these countries begging for bailouts. There's no hope in sight. So it's a complete disaster, essentially.
It is a disaster, and I think that we would be naive to believe that. Honestly, I think you would really have to be naive to believe this is all organic. That this path that Europe is going on and the world is going on because of sovereign debt, fiat debt, is organic. It just happened by mistake. I mean, would you agree with that? That we would literally, at this point in this awaken movement, we would have to be utterly naive to believe it's not by design.
Oh, absolutely. Very few things in this world are by mistake or by accident. And so, we know that the elite love to bring order out of chaos. And I believe that I believe that they're positioning themselves, and in fact, we've seen the ultra wealthy and the big corporations and the big banks positioning their money, pulling it out of certain places, putting it into certain places. They're getting into position. They know what's coming, and I believe they plan to use it to further their ends. And I believe when this is all over, we're going to see a much more federalized Europe, a much more centralized Europe, a much more integrated Europe. And because that's the solution they always give us, is more globalization, more control for the central banks. And we're going to see that in the United States as well. You asked about what effect will this have on the United States. Well, people in the United States need to realize that Europe has a bigger population than we do. They have a bigger economy than we do, and they have a much bigger banking system. And when they go down, it's going to affect the entire globe. Just like when Wall Street kind of collapsed back in 2008, 2009, it affected the four corners of the earth. It's going to happen once again. And especially now, even in the past 4 or 5 years, the global financial system has just become more globalized, more integrated. So what affects Europe is going to affect the banks on Wall Street as well. And personally, I think we're going to see more unraveling over July and August, but I'm particularly concerned about the September, October, November timeframe. I've been hearing a lot of things, and historically, that's when we see a lot of stock market collapses. They tend to be concentrated in the fall. When we see, for example, the last financial crisis happened in the fall.
Yeah, so October surprise.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that time frame, September, October, November.
Yeah, I agree, and it seems that we're rushing headlong into it, and we are being prepped. We're being prepared. We're being prepped for this. It isn't a day goes by where we don't hear the talking heads talking about the implosion of the euro or the European crisis could drag down the economy, and it literally almost makes me sick when I see Bernanke coming on talking about, we experienced some stiff winds in our recovery, and it's coming out of Europe, as if they weren't part and parcel for helping create this nightmarish scenario in the first place. And one aspect that I keep trying to hammer home to people is don't lose interest in this topic because it is Europe. Forget about the fact that it's Europe. Okay, this globe has been integrated. This globe is connected on every front, including and most assuredly financially. When the IMF talks about money, they're talking about your money, America. We are the number one contributor to the IMF. When Ben Bernanke talks about currency swaps, he's talking about bailouts. So whatever happens in Europe will absolutely, not like during the Depression where it was a delayed lag between collapsing Europe and the United States, where something would happen there and it would take a while to feel here. Forget about that. It's instantaneous. If we have a credit freeze tomorrow morning because of the European debt crisis, it will be a credit freeze in Europe. It will be a credit freeze here. This is why these institutions, just a year ago, all jockeyed their portfolios, if you will, in order to take the quadrillion, some estimates are, the low conservative estimates are, J.P. Morgan put $74 trillion worth of notional value of derivatives into a publicly backed division of their company. It isn't by mistake that they're hedging and they're positioning their potential huge losses on the back of the American people. They know what is coming, and they know that when Europe goes, it will be instantaneous crisis in this country as well.
Oh, absolutely. And you brought up a key word, derivatives. And our largest banks, the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans, if you take the 9 largest U.S. banks, they have exposure to derivatives in excess of $200 trillion. And a lot of those derivatives are influenced by things worldwide, whether they're credit default swaps or they're tied to interest rates in this country or that country or the other thing. So they've got these trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars of bets, of side bets essentially. And the derivatives marketplace is very delicately balanced. It depends on stability in the financial system, and when things start rocking or things start really leaning one way or the other, we start seeing major problems. And in fact, we saw that problem with JP Morgan recently, where they said, well, we're going to lose $2 billion, but now estimates are 5, 6, 7, 20. I've seen estimates of that they're going to lose $30 billion. Nobody really knows. And so when people hear that word in the mainstream media, derivatives crisis, that is going to be a key to things that have really progressed very far.
We're already hearing it, though. We're hearing the cost of insurance, the cost of these credit default swaps are starting to really rise with the rising borrowing costs of these nations of Europe. So, I mean, it was a notional value of what? $1 billion, $2 billion that shut down MF Global. They talked about $2 billion loss with Jamie Dimon's company, but now we really find out that it could be $2 billion. It could be $100 billion. It could be $1 trillion. It could be trillions. We just don't know. That's the thing. These over-the-counter derivatives, they're not regulated. This is their little own casino gambling game, and they managed to set it up beautifully that if they win, they win. If they lose, you lose. They don't lose, you lose.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I always try to bring it back to, because this isn't just monopoly money that we're talking about. When things go south, just look at what's happening in Greece with all the suffering, and we talk about the government debt and everything. But if you look at the effect on people's lives, people can't find work. We've seen suicides absolutely skyrocket in Greece. We've got people going and leaving their children at orphanages, at government agencies, saying we can't take care of them any longer.
Right.
So as you said, the suffering always comes back to the average person on the street, and we've never recovered from the last financial crisis. We're not back to where we were in 2007 or 2008 before the last financial crisis. We're weaker, we're more vulnerable, we've taken some blows, we've got a lot of damage. Now this next crisis is coming, and it's going to blindside the U.S. economy, and we're already in a weakened state. We've never recovered, and when this next one hits, it's going to take us down even farther.
Yeah, and let's get into that a little bit with about 7-8 minutes left here. Let's get into that a little bit, because we're talking about a crisis that would make the subprime thing look like nothing. I mean, literally look like chump change. We know now that it's in the trillions of dollars that has been shelled out to banks around the world in order to kick the can down the road so far, 4.5, 5 years. But what's coming is so much larger than that. Again, we don't know how. Could be $1 quadrillion. We don't know. But we are at a point where we have not recovered from 2008. Your wages are falling. Your standard of living is falling. Home ownership is falling. The value of your home is falling. In fact, you recently wrote an article, 22 stats, that prove the American dream is being systematically destroyed. And it's pretty telling that not only did we not recover, we're on the edge of going off the cliff the other way.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the statistics that really blew me away is that according to the Federal Reserve, if you look back at 2007, the median net worth of families in the United States was $126,400. Now, fast forward 3 years later, after the financial crisis, after the recession, in 2010, the median net worth of American families was only $77,300. So the median net worth of American families declined by almost $50,000 in just 3 years. And many ways we see things continue to get worse. For example, when Barack Obama came into office, there were 32 million Americans on food stamps. Now there are 46 million Americans on food stamps. So things continue to get worse. Meanwhile, we see prices continue to rise on the basic things like electricity, gasoline, and all those things, food in the stores. Meanwhile, wages are stagnating or going down in many areas of the country. So American families are more stressed than ever before, and their financial cushions are being eaten up. In fact, one survey found that 42% of all American workers are currently living paycheck to paycheck, and 28% of all Americans do not have a single penny saved up for emergencies. So they're extremely vulnerable. We've got this massive group of Americans that if they lose their job or their business goes under or if there's some reversal, they could be out on the street within a matter of weeks.
Yep. Yeah, that's a fact. In fact, I did a video when that report came out, the one you initially referred to there about the average household's net worth. And 37%. I see in your article here some estimates have it up at even higher than that. And what I found funny is when this report came out, good old Alfred Gottschalk, he's an official for the Census Bureau. He credited the decline of the average household's net worth to a slump in the stock market and a slump in housing. Like this is some random occurrence. Like the stock market is a cyclical event. The stock market declined, and so these people lost the people lost 37% of our net worth. Yet in the same time period you're talking about, we've seen companies like J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citi, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, all have worths well over $1 trillion in most cases. We've seen their value has skyrocketed to the point where they're much, much larger than they were before the collapse of 2008. And the interesting thing is the value of these companies, if we add up J.P. Morgan, this is a late 2011 number. If we add up J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citi, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs, they come in right at about $8.5 trillion. That's their street value. Okay, the amount of dollars the American people lost in that same amount of time of their household wealth is $7 trillion. I mean, so we've literally whittled down the worth of the people of this nation in order to let these companies exist on this day and age. This is why many times I've said that these institutions should be public utilities because we've completely and totally paid for them.
Oh, and it's very true. And the very wealthy are getting wealthier, and meanwhile the middle class is shrinking, and the poor are exploding. In fact, according to Forbes, the 400 wealthiest Americans now have more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans combined.
Just sick.
Yeah, it blows my mind. And today, 48% of all Americans are either considered to be low income or are living in poverty. And 49.1% of all Americans live in a home where at least one person is receiving financial benefits from the federal government. So the ranks of the poor just continue to expand. The middle class is shrinking, and another downturn is headed our way. And it's going to hurt the poor and the middle class much more than the very wealthy. And that's why the number one thing I'm encouraging people to do is right now build up that financial cushion. If you can get it to at least 6 months where if you lose your job, if something happens, if your business goes under, you can at least pay your bills for at least 6 months, and that will enable you to hopefully have some breathing room where you can make plans or figure out what to do. Because way too many, when the last financial crisis hit, way too many people lost their jobs then because they had no cushion. Then they couldn't pay the mortgage, they were foreclosed on, and they're out on the street very quickly. You don't want that to happen to you.
It's funny because you mentioned the disparity, the wealth gap. The wealth disparity between the haves and the have-nots is exploded. I mean, it's out of control. But look, again, by design, the people who are sitting here just raking this in, hand over fist, can't fail. If they do fail, it isn't their failure, it's your failure. They are going to be positioned to absolutely buy this nation, top to bottom, when we go through this next blowout, this next economic blowout. This is why when we have Goldman Sachs board meetings, when it was reported a year ago that their number one investment opportunity is infrastructure. they know exactly what is coming, Michael.
Oh, absolutely. And when things fall apart, they're going to get bailed out again. If Mitt Romney gets in there, of course. Mitt Romney is a wonderful friend of Wall Street. He's going to bail them out. We already know Obama's going to bail them out. But who's going to bail out the hardworking Americans who are barely making it as it is? Today, 1 out of every 4 American workers has a job that pays $10 an hour or less. And you can't support a family on $10 an hour. So most people are just barely scraping by. If they can find a job. I mean, I feel so bad for those coming out of college today. I saw a statistic a while back that said 53% of all U.S. college graduates under the age of 25 were either unemployed or underemployed last year. There's not enough jobs for everyone, and people are hurting.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And then they end up finishing school with a huge mountain of debt on their back. Micheal Snyder, the Economic Collapse blog, as well as the American Dream. Guys, use his material. Use his very simple-to-understand material to try to wake your friends and family and coworkers and loved ones up. This is why we have him on the program, because he does an excellent job of breaking it down so anybody can understand. Even if people are sound asleep, they can look at these stats and realize things are not right. Micheal Snyder, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on. We'll get you back on next month. Guys, please enjoy Jeff Rense, because he's coming up next. Tomorrow night, Hillary Ramo and Colonel Douglas McGregor. It's going to be a great show. Hopefully you can make it. All right, guys, have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.